Um, Now we move on to a story which came to my attention earlier this month and kind of made me giggle a little bit here. This is an article published on the 7th of October, uh, and it's called Viking Therapy Club, where
Yes.
men fight their demons. Now, I have a background. I have a background, and my background is very much tied up with people who do reenactment. I spent several years working at the Orvik Viking Centre, where I bumped into lots of people who have, um, well, a variety of emotions, I guess, ranging from an affinity and an affection for the period, which leads them to fairly, I suppose, professionally enact that for people. So they'll introduce people to maybe the Vikings and the Saxons through dress, costume, food, and this kind of thing. All the way through, though, on the other end of that spectrum, are people who pretty much want to live as modern day Viking warriors. And I have to say that end of the spectrum is one which, again, I know, I understand, and I've met many people who are deeply into that. But it's not one that I've really ever really dived into. It always felt a bit more like it's too much of a busman's holiday to go and get dressed up as a Viking and hit people. Um, but what do you think of the idea of people using this as a form of therapy, sort of exploring and reaffirming their masculine urges?
I think it's a really interesting piece, and thank you for pointing it out to me. I'm like you. I do have a real interest in the reenactment world, or perhaps the living history world, as we should call it. And I know a lot of people who are active in the sector like to call it.
Hmm.
Um, Living history, I think, is an incredibly valuable tool for making the past interesting and relevant to a non-specialist public. It can also be a great deal of fun. I mean, I've done a limited amount of costume work myself, both in looking in the work I've done on World War Two, but also on earlier periods and particularly things I've done in school. I think, and I think the value of it for a general audience, first of all, is it takes them away from their present. If you're dressed in a different way, if you're you no longer have a mobile phone and pockets on your clothes, there's immediately a difference to the world that we live in now. If the materials that you're dressed in are all natural linens and wools and
Hmm.
so on, that's different to the polycotton mixes and so on that most of the stuff that we wear in everyday 21st century life is made.
Hmm.
So it has that value immediately. At a personal level, I mean, I've never wanted to escape from the time I've lived it. I'm living in for that reason, and I think people do it for psychological reasons. They also sometimes do it for political reasons. I'm aware of the controversy there's been in the World War II living history community, for example, with groups um, who do impressions of, in particular, the Waffen SS, where there have been anecdotal reports, certainly in a famous, in fact, slightly notorious BBC documentary in 2007, um, suggesting that maybe that people wanted to put on the uniform because it actually reflected the ideology.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, not everybody is in that case, but there are certain documented cases where
No,
that
but
does
also,
appear
I
to
mean,
be the case.
also in the wake of Charlottesville, for example,
Yeah,
there was a very strong resonance there between very right wing political views and wanting to sort of dress up like Vikings. I mean, I think we touched on this, I think last month or maybe
we
the
did
month
before.
before.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so in that sense, yeah, there is that element to it. But I think if we sort of, I think most of these guys, it looks like they're doing it because it's a hobby, it's a passion, it is escapism. I mean,
Mm,
what one guy here says, a lot of people who do this are sort of adrenaline junkies,
mm,
but also as well. I mean, there's a quote here. That's interesting. When I was younger, I used to get into a lot of fights. That anger and frustration was with me for a very long time. And they talk about how actually this is an outlet. It gives them a release of natural violent urges that we all have as humans. And this is on the one hand, I think fairly relatable, I guess.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, my reaction then, with this background and with knowing lots of these guys and having a certain sympathy and empathy uh, and camaraderie with the living history element,
Mm.
at this stage, I sort of find myself saying, well, actually, maybe you should just be talking to a therapist as well. Into much as yes, people can have violent urges, and it can be a lot of fun. But it can also be quite dangerous. In so much as, and let me just briefly just outline. I mean,
Sure.
I was once in a situation where we were having fun one summer, it was summer season, training inverted commas training. Um, Children to fight. So we had
Yeah.
this sort of area fenced off, and we're going, yeah, come on in, child, blah, 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 and so going through with drills and shields and swords and spears. It was great fun.
Yeah.
And every now and then there would also be a demonstration from two of the guys on the staff, and I never got involved in the demonstration because, frankly, at that point I was much more. I was trying to be more of an archaeologist than a reenactor when I was working at Jorvik. So, but it was fun to watch. Unfortunately, though, on one particular event, one of the guys had just had a really bad breakup, and he came into that arena with no. He just wasn't grounded. And one of the first things that you're told and you're taught when you're handling what are dangerous implements, they may not be as sharp as the real thing, but
Yeah.
they're heavy and dangerous, is that essentially you have to be always aware and in control of this thing that you're swinging around. Basically, he nearly, it's no exaggeration to say that he nearly killed someone. He nearly killed actually his opposite number by just thinking, uh, no, well, not reading the signs, not seeing in the person that he was reenacting with, he was demonstrating with, the fact that actually he had in fact hurt him. He wasn't acting, and then also actually almost hitting him square in the head, basically with a reenactment axe. Thankfully, it didn't get that far, and then this guy did actually have to go and the injured party had to go to A&E, but this chap did actually go and seek some talking therapy actually for his because he had a complete disconnect between reenactment and demonstrating, and actually
Yeah.
the physical manifestation of his frustration. And I suppose this is where it just gives me a little bit of pause for thought. Is that if you tell yourself this is therapy,
Yeah.
you may go too far.
That's really interesting. In thinking about that, though, I immediately think of people who play contact sports. So I'll give you an example. My son plays rugby,
Hmm.
and I've never played rugby. I did play a bit of football when I was younger, but I've not played, for many years. So Marcus is very into playing rugby, which obviously is about the most physical of contact sports that you can get in a Western country like Great Britain.
Hmm.
And on occasions, I mean, he's talked about people, for example, who lose it on the field for whatever reason,
Hmm.
and end up sin binned or even red carded for dangerous play. Um, and that's in a very highly controlled environment where the referee's word is absolutely final, and everybody is taught how to scrum safely and tackle safely, and so on. And so, it can happen in regular recognised sport. We see it every weekend in a football match or a rugby match. There are a few cases of people who lose the sense of perspective. So to have it happen when people are pretending to go at each other with, albeit blunt, weapons, however well they've been trained, it's not surprising. It's human nature. It will happen.
Hmm.
And I think I can I can understand again why people would want to do it from an adrenaline point of view. It is exciting. The limited amount of exposure I've had to that kind of world, I can see absolutely why people do it. In fact, I remember talking to a colleague who was a reenactor who reckoned that there were different grades of reenacting, and that people who maybe there's a bit of prejudice going here because he was actually a late medievalist, but and did the period of Wars of the Roses. but he reckoned that most people that joined the Vikings did so because the fights were better.
Mm.
Now, okay, there's a bit of prejudice going on there, but you know, in terms of the culture, it's normally presented as a sort of very individual. You know, it's the saga hero.
Well, and yeah, and so there is actually an element there as well, as much as a lot of people who turn up to these groups, they'll be wearing the gear
Mm,
that's one in 1,000. They'll be wearing, you know, the Coppergate helmet and the chainmail vest, and
yeah.
they'll be wearing the stuff that most people wouldn't wear. And actually, a good reenactment group or living history group will actually encourage a certain ratio of well dressed all the way. Actually, in fact, some groups that you join, they'll make you start as a slave,
Yes.
and you have to. And I'm not sure I agree with that personally. I think you should be able to start, you know, enjoying it at the level
Mm,
that you want to. And out of that comes a great deal of camaraderie as well, I think, for
yes.
lots of people. But I
Yeah.
think there's also another element here that possibly should be explored, and maybe actually could in fact even be the subject of a good study or two. And that is, I mean, for example, there's a quote here: most of us here feel a connection with the ancient ways of thinking, pre-Christian beliefs. Only this, combined with aggression, makes a Viking.
Yeah.
Again, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's in this sense, it is. This is where there's also an element of authenticity that I find curious because see, people start to map on eventually very individualistic biases and agendas, especially, for example, an anti-Christian agenda, which
Yes.
is fine, but they map it onto their personal beliefs onto a whole culture and society, and then that becomes a sort of a mentality that's encouraged within a group, and then out of that comes actually something which is not history. And I think this is really where we come all the way back down to the beginning of this conversation here, where actually this is a very interesting intersection of, I suppose, a historical pastiche, taking things and objects and symbols and clothing and weapons
Mm,
that we find in the archaeological record and that are attested to in historical documents, and seeing where that sort of collides with people who are looking for something else. They're looking for
yeah.
an expression of something,
I
and
think. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think the other interesting the final point really I'd make on this. Well, it's two points very quickly,
mm,
really. One is that I know and I agree with you. I think that there's relatively little literature on this at the moment, and
mm,
there's some very good uh, anecdotal reporting, and there's a wonderful book called The Confederate in My Attic, talking about American Civil War living history. Um, but I think, you know, one of the buzzwords again in reenactor world these days is impressions. You do an impression of a particular period, of a
mm,
particular person from a particular period, and I think that's absolutely crucial that we don't lose track of that. You know, what you do in 2017 as a Viking or a Roman or American Civil War trooper or whatever can only be your impression of what that person's existence was.
mm,
You know, you cannot live as a Viking. You cannot live as a Confederate trooper. You
no,
know, all you can do is inhabit what you think that world might have been like for a period.
mm.
You know,
But
uh,
also in that sense, that is, and I guess I mean my final thoughts on this would be along the lines of that is essentially what archaeology is as well.
oh yeah,
Yeah, the things that we understand as being history, the artifacts that we recover, and the realities that we paint for people using those artifacts can never be the actual period.
no, no, I agree with you. But there's
Mm,
one other thing from this article which I wanted to point out before we finish this part of the of watching brief, and that's the section that struck me most was a gentleman called Norman Hewitt, who is quoted
mm,
in as one of the people who is a member of the Jomsvikings, and he's black.
mm,
Now it happens to be Black History Month, and and he talks about how when you know, he was involved in the 1990s in football hooliganism. The Jomsburg Vikings, he says, gave him an outlet for his aggression, which we can argue, his obvious discomfort with the society that he was living in, maybe as a young black man. He got involved with the Jomsburg Jomsburg Vikings, he talks about that he still gets racism and quotes funny looks from some quarters at Viking events, whereas but the character he plays is a North African Muslim called Bin Yusuf, and we
Hmm.
know about the interactions between the Arab world and the Viking world. It's absolutely legitimate for him to
Hmm.
take on that impression
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
show that that world of the past wasn't white
No, no.
exclusively.
No, and well, as we've talked about previously, the fact that the Vikings, the word for a black man was a blauwman. They knew about them, they met them, they did travel up into the north of Europe,
Yeah,
and so in that sense, yeah, there's a real opportunity to again bring another texture, a texture of what we understand about the past to people.
absolutely.
Also, just, I suppose an element again. I guess this will be the final element here, and something which I would like to acknowledge is that yes, okay, there are. I find it curious and odd that people want to use this as a form of therapy, as it were, as opposed to a sort of an expression of history. But that's again, I guess that's a very personal perspective. But I do very much acknowledge and have also been the recipient of this idea here. There's a quote here saying, "If you live the real life, you feel good, you feel strong, you feel the bonds with your warrior brothers, you gain fulfillment." And I have actually experienced that as well. In that sense, if you're working, and in that sense, it's almost like any working environment. But
Yeah,
when I was working at Jorvik, we were the Vikings, and we were having a great time together, working together. In that sense, very much playing together with weapons, um, drinking together, and yeah. So this is probably an extremely fun and healthy environment. But I suppose I came into this just with that slight caveat, I guess,
mm,
of you probably need to be careful how you frame it because it can also be quite quite dangerous.